Waiter who insulted Big Shaq didn't know he owned the restaurant. The evening was alive with energy inside the popular restaurant. Glasses clinked as waiters hurried back and forth, balancing trays of drinks and plates of food with practiced ease. The sound of forks against plates blended with laughter and casual conversations, creating a warm hum that filled every corner of the space. People from different walks of life came to this place because it was known for its fine dining experience, and the waitstaff usually made sure every guest felt special. Among them, however, there was one waiter whose attitude often stood out, not in a good way. His name was Colin. Colin had been working in the restaurant for almost a year. He was young, full of confidence, and often too quick to judge people. When he looked at a customer, the first thing he noticed wasn't their smile or their politeness, it was their clothes, the way they walked, or how much money he thought they had. To him, those signs told him whether a person deserved his full respect or just the bare minimum service. The restaurant was his stage, and in his mind, he was smarter than many of the guests who came in. He thought he could tell exactly who was important and who wasn't, just by a glance. That evening, as Colin busied himself setting down menus and filling glasses, the front door opened. A tall man stepped inside. He wasn't dressed in anything fancy, just a plain shirt and jeans. His shoes weren't polished leather, and there was no shiny watch on his wrist. He didn't carry himself like someone used to being waited on with care. To Colin's eyes, he looked like just another regular man, maybe even someone who had no business in such a high-end restaurant. Colin quickly turned his head and muttered to himself, "Here we go again, another one who probably can't afford dessert." The man, however, walked with quiet confidence. He didn't try to demand attention, nor did he seem out of place, despite his casual clothes. He glanced around, nodded politely to the hostess, and asked for a table. The hostess gave him a kind smile and guided him to a seat. From across the room, Colin noticed and rolled his eyes. He leaned toward another waiter and whispered, "Watch this guy order the cheapest thing on the menu and sit here all night." The other waiter didn't laugh, he just shook his head and went back to work. As Colin approached the table, he wore a professional smile, but there was no warmth in it. He placed the menu down with a little too much force, as though the man didn't deserve a gentle touch. "Here's the menu. Take your time," Colin said quickly, without making proper eye contact. The man simply nodded and thanked him politely. Colin barely noticed the thanks because he was already walking away, convinced this customer wasn't worth any real effort. What Colin didn't know was that this wasn't just another man looking for dinner. This man was Big Shaq, a successful businessman who had recently invested in several ventures, including restaurants. In fact, this very restaurant was one of his properties. Shaq had chosen to come quietly, without any announcement, to see how things were running. He wanted to experience the service the same way any regular guest would. He believed in treating everyone equally and wanted to make sure his staff carried the same values. But as he sat there watching Colin's dismissive attitude, he realized this night might turn into a lesson far more powerful than just a meal. The restaurant bustled around him, but Shaq remained calm. He didn't rush, didn't demand attention, and didn't reveal who he was. He picked up the menu and looked at it carefully, taking his time. Colin glanced back occasionally, sighing each time he saw the man still reading. "Some people take forever and then just order water," he muttered under his breath, annoyed. The other staff members noticed Colin's impatience, but they kept quiet. They had seen him act this way before with people he judged as unimportant. Finally, Shaq closed the menu and raised his hand slightly to signal he was ready. Colin walked over, pen and notepad in hand, but his body language showed he wasn't interested. His shoulders slumped, and his tone carried no enthusiasm. "What will it be?" he asked flatly. Shaq smiled politely and gave his order in a calm, steady voice. Colin jotted it down quickly, barely looking up, and walked away as soon as the words left Shaq's mouth. From his seat, Shaq watched everything closely. He noticed how Colin behaved with other tables, smiling more for well-dressed couples, offering extra attention to guests who looked wealthy, and showing a completely different side of himself when he thought it mattered. Shaq didn't get upset, instead, he grew thoughtful. He knew he would have to address this later, not just for himself but for the values he wanted his restaurant to stand for. As the kitchen prepared the meal, Colin continued to show his careless attitude. He dropped off Shaq's drink without a word, didn't ask if he needed anything else, and rushed away before Shaq could respond. Some guests nearby raised their eyebrows, noticing the lack of respect. One older gentleman whispered to his wife, "That's not how you treat a customer." Surprising for a place like this. His wife nodded quietly. Shaq, however, remained unbothered. He took a sip of his drink and waited patiently. His calmness was not weakness, it was the quiet strength of someone who knew exactly who he was. He didn't need to prove anything to a waiter who had already judged him. What Colin failed to see was that sometimes the simplest looking person could hold the most power. The evening carried on, and the restaurant grew busier. Orders piled up, waiters rushed, and Colin's attitude grew sharper as he became more tired. But through it all, Shaq continued to observe. He wasn't just looking at the food or the service, he was looking at the heart of the place. To him, the way staff treated guests defined the soul of the restaurant. And what he saw in Colin was a problem that needed to be corrected, not just for business but for the kind of respect that every human being deserved. By the time the meal arrived, Colin placed it down with little care, muttering, "Here you go," before hurrying off again. Shaq looked at the plate, then at the waiter's back as he walked away. A small smile touched his lips. This night, which began as a simple dinner, was now turning into an opportunity. Not only would Colin learn a lesson, but so would everyone watching. Respect wasn't about clothing, money, or appearance, it was about humanity. And as Shaq picked up his fork to take the first bite, he knew the real story of the night hadn't even begun yet. Colin moved from table to table with the same proud stride he always carried. To the customers who looked wealthy or stylish, he offered wide smiles, polite words, and sometimes even jokes to make them feel welcome. But whenever he looked back at the tall man in simple clothes, his face hardened, and his tone grew flat. The difference was so clear that even other diners began to notice it. Shaq, sitting calmly at his table, saw all of this. He watched how Colin leaned down politely to speak with a man in a sharp suit, carefully refilling his wine glass, and then just a moment later dropped off bread at his table without a single word. Colin didn't even glance at him long enough to see the polite smile Shaq had ready. It was as though Shaq was invisible, unworthy of the same respect shown to others. When Shaq had finished his first drink, he waited a while for a refill. He looked around, patient as ever, but Colin didn't return. Instead, he was busy laughing with another waiter near the bar. At last, Shaq lifted his hand slightly to signal for attention. Colin saw him but didn't hurry over. He took his time, pretending to be busy with something else. When he finally walked to the table, his steps were slow, and his words sharp. "Another drink?" he asked, his voice carrying no kindness. "Yes, please," Shaq replied calmly. Colin scribbled it down without even making eye contact and walked away. To him, this was just another customer, maybe even a burden. What Colin didn't realize was that every little action, every dismissive word, was being carefully stored in the mind of the man who owned not only the chair he sat on but the very walls around them. As minutes passed, Colin's behavior grew even more careless. When another group of guests walked in, dressed in glamorous clothes and expensive jewelry, he rushed to greet them, his voice filled with enthusiasm. He bowed slightly, offered compliments about their outfits, and guided them to their table with extra care. He even gave them a menu with both hands, as though it were some grand gesture. Shaq saw all of this while waiting patiently for his simple drink. When Colin finally brought it over, He placed it down with a thud. The glass wobbled slightly, and a drop spilled on the tablecloth. Colin didn't bother to wipe it. He simply muttered, "Here," and walked off without checking if Shaq needed anything else. Nearby, a young couple exchanged glances. They whispered softly about how strange it was that such a well-known restaurant had a waiter who treated guests so differently. One of them said, "He's so warm to that group, but look at how he ignores the tall guy. That's not right." The other nodded, shaking their head in quiet disappointment. Shaq, however, remained unshaken. He sipped his drink slowly, his expression calm. His years of experience had taught him patience. He wasn't the kind of man who exploded in anger or demanded attention to prove who he was. He believed that truth always revealed itself at the right time. Right now, he was simply gathering the truth for himself. A little later, Colin returned to take Shaq's main order. But instead of asking politely or suggesting dishes with a smile, he stood with his notepad, shifting from one foot to another as though he had no time to waste. "So, what'll it be?" he said quickly. Shaq looked up at him with steady eyes, then gave his order clearly. Once again, Colin jotted it down, turned on his heel, and walked away without another word. He didn't ask if Shaq wanted starters or sides. He didn't even say thank you. To him, it was just another box ticked off on his busy evening list. Back in the kitchen, Colin chuckled to another waiter. "That guy doesn't look like he belongs here. Bet he just wanted to try this place to feel fancy. Watch, he'll complain about the prices when the bill comes." His words were full of judgment, and though some of the staff stayed quiet, a few shook their heads, silently disagreeing. They knew all customers deserved respect, but no one wanted to challenge Colin directly. Meanwhile, Shaq sat back in his chair, looking around the restaurant he owned. He noticed how guests enjoyed their meals, how the chefs worked hard in the kitchen, and how most of the staff gave their best effort. It was only Colin who poisoned the atmosphere with his arrogance. Shaq thought about the kind of values he wanted his restaurant to represent: warmth, equality, and respect for everyone. What he was witnessing was the exact opposite of that. As the food arrived, Colin placed the plate in front of Shaq without ceremony. "There," he said plainly, almost as if he were doing him a favor. He didn't pause to see if Shaq needed anything else. He didn't ask how the food looked or if he wanted another drink. He just set it down and walked away, hurrying back to the tables that, in his eyes, mattered more. Shaq gazed at the dish before him, then glanced around the room. He saw how Colin treated the glamorous group, checking on them every few minutes, bringing extra bread, and even suggesting a special dessert. His attention was entirely theirs, while Shaq sat alone, overlooked and dismissed. The difference was clear to everyone who cared to notice. One elderly woman at another table watched the whole scene. She leaned toward her husband and said softly, "It's sad, isn't it? The way he's treating that gentleman. Doesn't he know respect should be given to all?" Her husband sighed, agreeing. "Some people never learn until it's too late," he replied. Shaq, with quiet dignity, picked up his fork and began his meal. Every bite was thoughtful, not because of the taste but because of the lesson forming in his mind. He knew this evening wasn't just about food. It was about showing, in time, that true respect had nothing to do with money, clothing, or appearance. Colin, on the other hand, walked around feeling proud of himself. He thought he had read Shaq correctly, just another man trying to enjoy a meal he probably couldn't afford. He believed he was clever, able to spot who was worth his time. What Colin didn't realize was that every smirk, every careless gesture, was digging him deeper into a hole of his own making. As the evening grew busier, Colin's arrogance only grew. He whispered again to a colleague, laughing at Shaq's quiet demeanor. "He looks so out of place. Probably going to leave a tiny tip too," he joked. The colleague didn't laugh this time. Instead, he glanced at Shaq and then back at Colin, a hint of unease in his eyes. Something told him that Colin's words might come back to haunt him. Shaq ate quietly, finishing his meal with patience. He didn't complain, didn't snap his fingers, and didn't demand attention. But deep inside, he knew the moment of truth was coming. For now, he let the waiter believe he was just another customer. The lesson, when revealed, would be far more powerful this way. As Shaq set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, he looked around once more. The restaurant was thriving, but the heart of its service was broken by one man's pride. Soon, very soon, that truth would no longer be hidden. And Colin, still unaware of who sat at the table he had dismissed all evening, had no idea how close he was to the shock of his life. Shaq sat quietly at his table, enjoying the food but not the service. Every now and then, he glanced around the restaurant and noticed the small details most guests would miss. He saw how the lights above each table gave the place a warm, golden glow. He heard the faint music playing in the background, soft enough not to disturb but pleasant enough to create comfort. He even noticed the chefs occasionally peeking from the kitchen, proud to see guests enjoying the meals they had worked so hard to prepare. All these things reflected the heart of the restaurant. But there was one part of the experience that spoiled it: the behavior of Colin, the waiter who thought too much of himself. Colin had no idea who Shaq was. To him, Shaq was just a tall man in simple clothes who came in alone and didn't look like he belonged in such an expensive place. So he continued treating him with little attention and almost no respect. When Shaq asked for water, Colin delivered it without even looking at him. When Shaq's main dish was served, Colin didn't check if it was cooked to his liking. When other tables needed him, he smiled, cracked small jokes, and even bent down to talk politely. But when it came to Shaq, he acted as though his presence was a burden. What Colin didn't realize was that Shaq was not only the guest but also the silent owner of the restaurant. Months ago, Shaq had bought it because he believed in the vision of good food, friendly service, and respect for all customers. He wanted it to be a place where everyone, no matter who they were, could feel welcomed. But tonight, sitting here as a normal guest, he saw something very different. Shaq leaned back and observed Colin closely. He noticed the impatience in his steps whenever he came to his table. He noticed how Colin's voice sounded rushed and sharp, as though he was eager to leave. He even caught Colin whispering and laughing with another waiter while glancing at him. Shaq's calm eyes didn't show anger, but inside, he knew this behavior was wrong. Not wrong just toward him, but wrong toward anyone who walked into his restaurant. A part of Shaq wanted to reveal himself right away, to call the manager over and show Colin exactly who he was. But Shaq wasn't that kind of man. He wasn't quick to anger or quick to punish. He believed in patience. He wanted to see the full measure of Colin's behavior, to understand whether this was just one mistake or a pattern. By remaining silent, he gave Colin the chance to either realize his mistake or continue down the same path. The meal went on, and Colin only grew more careless. At one point, Shaq raised his hand politely to ask for another side dish. Colin saw the signal but chose to serve a group of wealthy-looking customers first. He smiled at them, poured their wine, and asked about their day, all while Shaq waited patiently. When Colin finally walked over, his voice carried annoyance. "Yes, what do you need now?" he asked, tapping his pen on the notepad. Shaq kept his tone steady and polite. "Could I have the roasted vegetables on the side, please?" Colin sighed loudly before writing it down. "Fine. I'll add it," he muttered, and walked away. Guests at the neighboring table exchanged uneasy looks. One of them whispered, "Did you hear the way he spoke to that man? That's not how you treat a guest." The other nodded in agreement, frowning at the lack of respect they had just witnessed. Shaq, however, showed no reaction. He simply waited for his order, his calm presence filling the space. But inside, he was making mental notes. Colin wasn't just being rude, he was exposing his true character. He didn't know that the man he was insulting held his future in his hands. The longer Shaq sat there, the more he realized something important. Colin's behavior wasn't just about him. It was about a bigger problem: the habit of judging people based on appearance. Shaq had seen it many times in his life, people assuming things about him just because he didn't fit their idea of wealth or power. But what made it worse here was that Colin was in a position of service, where respect was the foundation of his job. If he couldn't treat all customers equally, then he didn't belong in this profession. The roasted vegetables arrived, again with no words of courtesy from Colin. He placed them down roughly, then walked off without a smile or even asking if Shaq needed anything else. Shaq glanced at the plate, then at Colin's retreating back. For a moment, he thought about how ironic the situation was. Here he was, the owner, being treated like an unimportant guest by someone who worked under him. It almost made him smile, not because it was funny, but because it revealed the truth so clearly. Shaq took his time finishing the meal, each bite thoughtful. He didn't hurry. He wanted Colin to believe he was just another quiet customer. That way, the truth would hit harder when it was revealed. Meanwhile, Colin continued to brag quietly to another waiter. "That guy doesn't fit in here. I bet he'll argue about the bill or leave a small tip. People like that always do." His voice was full of arrogance, and he laughed at his own words. The other waiter didn't join in. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, sensing that Colin's pride was going too far. Shaq noticed the way other staff behaved too. Most of them were polite and hard-working. They served with genuine smiles, checked on their tables often, and treated everyone with care. It was only Colin who broke the chain, creating a shadow in a place that was supposed to shine with hospitality. By now, many guests had noticed. The whispers around the room weren't loud, but they were there. Some people shook their heads at the way Colin acted. A few even made mental notes to mention it in their reviews later. Without realizing it, Colin wasn't just insulting Shaq, he was hurting the reputation of the restaurant itself. Shaq remained silent, but his decision was already forming. This wasn't just about a single night. It was about the kind of values his restaurant stood for. And if Colin couldn't represent those values, then something had to change. As the night drew on, Shaq folded his napkin neatly and placed it on the table. He had finished his meal. His calm expression hadn't changed throughout, but his mind was clear. He was ready for the next step. The time for silence was ending. Soon, Colin would learn exactly who he had been insulting all evening. And when that truth came out, it wouldn't just be a shock, it would be a lesson he would never forget. When Shaq finished his meal, the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. The crowd had grown larger, the sound of clinking glasses louder, and the air filled with laughter and chatter. The waiters rushed from table to table, carrying trays stacked with food and drinks. Colin, still carrying himself with an air of superiority, kept avoiding Shaq's table unless absolutely necessary. To him, the tall man in simple clothes wasn't worth the effort. He believed he had already figured him out. Shaq, however, had been calm the entire evening. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or demand attention. But now, as he set down his fork and gently folded his napkin, he knew it was time to reveal the truth. He had given Colin enough chances. He had observed long enough. The moment of silence was over. Shaq raised his hand slightly, signaling to Colin. The waiter sighed as though disturbed and made his way over, pen tucked behind his ear, notepad in hand. His tone was dismissive. "Ready for the bill?" he asked, barely looking at Shaq. "Yes," Shaq replied politely. Then, after a pause, he added, "Also, could you ask the manager to come here? I'd like to speak with them." Colin frowned, instantly assuming the man wanted to complain. In his mind, he thought, "Here we go, probably going to whine about the prices or say the service wasn't fast enough. He smirked a little, almost amused. Without saying anything more, he walked toward the back, where the manager was speaking with another staff member. "The guy at table 7 wants to see you," Colin said with a chuckle. "Looks like he's got some complaint. Probably about the food or something small. Honestly, he doesn't look like he could afford this place anyway." The manager frowned. "Colin, that's not how we talk about guests. Every customer is important. Watch your words." But Colin just shrugged, brushing off the warning. He still didn't realize how close he was to the biggest shock of his life. The manager straightened his jacket and walked over to Shaq's table. The moment he saw Shaq, his expression changed. His eyes widened slightly, and his tone softened with respect. "Good evening, sir," he said warmly. "It's such an honor to have you here. How was everything tonight?" Colin, who had followed at a distance, froze. He blinked in confusion. "Wait, what? Why is the manager acting like this?" His smirk slowly faded, replaced by uncertainty. He leaned slightly forward, trying to catch what was happening. Shaq looked up at the manager with a calm smile. His voice was steady, but there was weight behind every word. "The food was excellent," he said. "The chefs did a wonderful job. The atmosphere is lively, and the other staff members worked hard tonight. But there's something we need to talk about." The manager nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Please, go ahead." Shaq's eyes shifted toward Colin, who was standing stiffly a few feet away. Then Shaq looked back at the manager. "I came here tonight not just to enjoy a meal," he said slowly. "I came to see how this restaurant is running. After all," he paused for a moment, letting the silence fill the space. "I own this restaurant." The words hit the air like thunder. The nearby tables went quiet. Guests who had overheard gasped softly, turning their heads in surprise. The staff members in the distance stopped what they were doing, their eyes widening as they looked toward Shaq. But no one's reaction was bigger than Colin's. His mouth dropped open, his face drained of color, and his body froze in place. The man he had mocked, dismissed, and disrespected all night was not just another customer, he was the owner. The very man who had the power to decide Colin's future. Shaq continued, his calm voice carrying across the silence. "I bought this restaurant months ago because I believed in the vision of good food, good service, and respect for every guest. Tonight, I came quietly, without announcing myself, because I wanted to see if those values were alive here. For the most part, I saw them. But I also saw something else." His eyes turned directly toward Colin now, sharp but controlled. "I saw a waiter who judged a guest by their clothes. I saw a man who believed some people were worth more respect than others. I saw arrogance where there should have been kindness. And that, in my restaurant, is unacceptable." Colin felt his chest tighten. His hands grew clammy, and his confident posture collapsed. The smirk he had worn all night was gone. Now, all he could feel was fear and shame. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his mind spinning. The manager looked shocked, glancing back at Colin with disappointment. Other guests were whispering to each other, shaking their heads at the waiter's behavior. A woman at a nearby table muttered softly, "No wonder the service was so poor for him. He had no idea." Shaq leaned forward slightly, his gaze still locked on Colin. "I came here to enjoy a meal, but what I got instead was a reminder. A reminder that respect isn't about who someone looks like. It isn't about money, clothes, or appearances. It's about treating every human being with dignity. And if you can't do that, you have no place here." Colin's legs felt weak. He finally managed to stammer, I didn't know, sir." "I didn't realize that's the point," Shaq interrupted, his voice firm but not raised. You didn't know. You thought you could decide who mattered and who didn't. But in this restaurant, every guest matters. Whether they walk in wearing a suit or simple jeans, they deserve the same respect. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, every ear tuned to the exchange. Shaq let the moment sink in before leaning back, his calm expression unchanged. So now, the choice is yours, Colin. You can learn from this and change your behavior, or you can walk away from this job. But if you stay, things must be different. Do you understand? Colin nodded quickly, his face burning with embarrassment. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I'll do better. I promise. His voice trembled, and his head hung low. Shaq studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. We'll see, he said quietly. The manager stepped forward, clearly shaken by the incident. Sir, I assure you this will never happen again. Thank you for bringing this to light. Shaq smiled faintly. It wasn't just for me. It was for everyone. This restaurant should be a place where respect is the first ingredient. As Shaq stood up, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Some guests clapped softly, impressed by the way he had handled the situation with calm authority. Others nodded, whispering about the powerful lesson they had just witnessed. Colin stood frozen, his pride shattered, his heart heavy with regret. He had thought himself clever, judging people so quickly. But now, in front of everyone, he had been exposed. The man he looked down on was the very one who signed his paychecks. Shaq walked toward the door, his tall frame steady, his steps unhurried. He had made his point without anger, without insults, and without raising his voice. That was his strength, teaching through dignity, not humiliation. And as he left the restaurant that night, everyone inside knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. The truth had been revealed, and respect had been redefined. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed with a new energy. The staff had arrived early, some nervously, others curiously, but all aware that the events of the previous evening had left a lasting impression. Colin arrived first, standing outside the restaurant for a few moments, his hands shaking slightly as he fidgeted with his uniform. He knew that today was a new beginning, but it was also a day to make amends. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, immediately noticing the subtle changes. The manager, Miss Harper, greeted him with a small smile but a firm look in her eyes. Colin, she said, I hope you're ready to start fresh today. Remember, respect comes first here, always. Colin swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am, he replied. He walked to the kitchen to grab a tray, trying to focus on the work rather than the embarrassment that still lingered. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake the memory of Shaq's calm, commanding words. Every phrase, every glance, every lesson seemed to echo in his mind. By the time the first customers arrived, Colin had started to notice the difference in himself. He greeted each guest with genuine warmth, asking about their day, smiling in a way that felt natural instead of forced. And slowly, he saw the reactions change. People responded positively to his newfound attitude, smiling back, thanking him, and even complimenting his service. It was a small, simple thing, but it filled him with a sense of pride he had never felt before. Later that morning, Miss Harper called Colin over. I've been watching you, she said, her tone calm but serious. You've made progress, and that's good. But today, you're going to meet someone very important. Colin felt his heart race. He looked around nervously. Who is it? He asked. You'll see, Miss Harper said with a smile. Just be yourself. Treat this person with the respect you should give every guest. Minutes later, the door opened, and in walked Shaq. This time, he wasn't in casual clothes but in a simple suit, looking calm and approachable. The atmosphere seemed to change the moment he entered, as if his presence alone carried a quiet authority. Colin felt his knees weaken slightly. He straightened immediately, feeling a mix of fear, anticipation, and a strong desire to do right this time. Shaq smiled as he approached the counter. "Good morning, Colin," he said warmly. "I wanted to check in and see how things are going today." Colin swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Good morning, sir. Everything is going well. I've been doing my best, and I'm working on being better with every customer." Shaq nodded approvingly. "I can see that. And that's what matters. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them and improving. That's what real character is about." The words struck Colin deeply. He had been so focused on impressing people or pretending to be better than he was that he had forgotten what truly mattered: honesty, respect, and hard work. Shaq's simple guidance made him realize that true strength wasn't in mocking others or acting superior, it was in treating people right, even when no one was watching. Over the next few weeks, the restaurant transformed in more ways than one. Colin worked diligently, always mindful of the lesson Shaq had taught him. He greeted every guest with genuine warmth, helped his co-workers without complaint, and even started noticing the small things that made each person's experience special. He began to take pride in his work, not because anyone demanded it, but because he understood its value. The other staff members noticed the change too. Some were surprised, some inspired, and some even laughed softly when they remembered Colin's previous arrogance. But gradually, everyone started to feel the difference. The restaurant felt lighter, friendlier, and more welcoming. People came not just for the food but for the way they were treated, and that was exactly what Shaq had hoped to create. One afternoon, a young boy and his mother walked into the restaurant. Colin noticed them immediately, and as he approached, he smiled warmly. "Welcome. How are you today?" The boy looked shy, hiding behind his mother. Colin knelt slightly to meet his eyes. "It's okay. I promise you'll have a great time here." He took their order and returned quickly, making small talk with the boy along the way. By the time their food arrived, the boy was laughing and chatting freely. The mother looked at Colin, impressed. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've made our visit special." Colin felt a warm glow in his chest. This was exactly the impact Shaq had talked about, the difference that kindness and respect could make. And he realized something important: real power wasn't about looking down on others. Real power was about lifting people up. As the days passed, Shaq continued to visit the restaurant, sometimes quietly observing, other times chatting with guests. Each time he came, he noticed the improvements not just in service but in the spirit of the place. Colin had become a different person, not just in behavior but in attitude and character. And for Shaq, that was more important than anything else. One evening, after the restaurant had closed and the last customers had left, Colin found himself alone with Miss Harper in the dining area. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, her eyes kind. "Shaq was impressed with how you've changed. But more importantly, I'm impressed. You've taken responsibility for your actions and grown from them. That's rare." Colin looked down, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "Thank you, ma'am. I never want to go back to the way I was before. I want to keep improving, not just here but in everything I do." Miss Harper smiled. "That's the right attitude. And remember, this isn't just about work. It's about life. Treat people well, and the world will respond in kind." Colin nodded, absorbing her words deeply. That night, as he walked home, he felt a lightness he had never known before. The shame of the past was still there, yes, but it no longer weighed him down. Instead, it had become a reminder, a guiding force to help him be better. Weeks turned into months, and Colin's transformation became a story among the staff. New employees who joined the restaurant were quickly told about how a young waiter had once been arrogant and dismissive but had learned a lesson that changed him forever. Colin's story became an example, a lesson in humility and respect, showing that anyone could change if they were willing to face their mistakes. One afternoon, Shaq came in for a special lunch. Colin greeted him, this time not with fear but with confidence. "Welcome back, sir. It's great to see you." Shaq smiled warmly. "It's great to see you too, Colin. How's everything going?" "Better than ever," Colin said. "The team is working well together, and the guests are happy. I've learned a lot from you, sir." "Thank you for that." Shaq nodded, his expression calm but pleased. "I didn't do much, Colin. You did the hard work yourself. I just gave you the opportunity to see things differently." Colin felt a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that the lesson he had learned was not just about respect in a restaurant, it was about respect in life. The simple truth that every person deserved dignity and kindness, regardless of how they looked or what they had reshaped him completely. That evening, as the restaurant closed and the lights dimmed, Colin stood at the entrance for a moment, looking around at the tables, the kitchen, and the staff. He felt proud not because of anything he had owned or achieved before, but because he had grown, because he had changed, and because he now understood the true meaning of respect and kindness. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that he would carry this lesson forever, not just for himself but for everyone he met. Because some lessons, once learned, could never be forgotten. They became a part of who you were, guiding your actions, shaping your character, and making the world a better place, one act of respect at a time.